All right, what is going on my beautiful people? It's the return of the watch list. It's 2026, and I took some time off at the end of the year in 2025. I went on vacation, right? Everything in the market really starts to slow down. And then coming into the new year, right? I kind of waited to start the watch list back up for things to kind of pick up. And, we're starting to see some action. So I said, all right, you know what? It's time to get back on the grind. We got to start giving the watch list to the people. And for those of you that don't know, right, what we do here on our channel is, we invest, right, with long term investing and trading in the short term, right? We make monies both ways, right? In the short term, in the long term, when the market's going up, when the market's going down, and we can get the quickest news in the world through, all of our news sources that I have basically aggregated over my whole investing career. So, the nightly watch list, the whole goal is, to talk about what happened in the market, things that we should be, looking forward to in the future, what happened, things to pay attention to, and it helps us keep our pulse on the market and knowing what's going on. And I talk about maybe names I added to the long term, trades that I'm doing, my entries, my exits. So I wanted to recap, what the watch list is about. But for those of you that don't know me, watch my one video I posted last year, why I started investing for Rob. But the premise is, I want to help out smaller individuals in the sense of, retail investors. For those of you that don't know, I used to be a financial advisor where I help people manage millions of dollars individually, and collectively I managed over $8 billion dollars. And, you know, I stopped doing that and I created this YouTube channel to help out, smaller investors, retail investors. So that's what I'm here for. And, I post some tutorial videos about things, and the nightly watch list is really there so everyone can stay on top of the news, keep their pulse on the market, and, just be aware of everything that's going on. So, without further ado, let's get into the first watch list for 2026. Now, I'm going to start things a little differently. Instead of talking about what happened, just today, I want to talk about my outlook for 2026. What could happen? What am I going to be paying attention to? What possible narratives are there going to be? What is, the media going to be pushing out there in the headlines? What are people going to get scared over, create volatility? What's going to cause, the next big move down, the moves up? So, most importantly, you don't have to just think day to day, but you got to look forward. What's going to be the narrative that they're kind of pushing out there? And, what could possibly happen, to move markets, if it's the stock market, if it's fixed income, if it's cryptocurrencies, right? So let's get into it. So first things first, right? Let's talk about rate cuts because, as everybody knows, 2025 was the year of rate cut talk. Everyone in 2025 was saying, the economy is going to crash, right? We have an AI bubble. The Fed is cutting rates because the economy is slowing, the labor market is tightening up, right? Hiring is slowing down. The economy is going to be, crashing. So, first things first, we have to be on the lookout for rate cuts in 2026. Now, the market is currently pricing in, right, 0 to 2 rate cuts. Okay, more than likely we're probably going to get 1 to 2. But I say 0 to 2 because there is a possibility that, maybe there's no rate cuts this year, right? It all depends on inflation. So, but right now the market is pricing in 0 to 2, and each cut would be 1/4%, or fancy people like to call it basis points or bips. So 25 basis point, you know, rate cut, two of them potentially in 2026. Now the market is not pricing in any rate cuts until June at the earliest, which is after Jerome Powell leaves, his position as the Federal Reserve Chairman. Now he'll step down in that position in May, and basically, people are expecting the earliest in June, right? And that's because Powell has kind of had a restrictive stance, and he says, we've been doing cuts, and once the Federal Reserve does interest rate cuts, we like to slow down and see, what happens with the market and the economy, right? It takes time for those cuts to kind of work their way through the economy. So he's not as fast, to cut rates. So people are saying, okay, well, he's going to be leaving in May. They're probably going to, stay still right now for the beginning of the year. So the market's pricing in the earliest cuts in June, which would be when the next Federal Reserve chairman is appointed. And for those of you that don't know, right, President Trump and Powell, kind of have a beef going on because Trump wants rates to be cut and Powell saying, no, I'm not going to be forced my hand to do this, right? The Fed's independent from the president, cabinet. We're not going to do what you guys just say. But Trump wants rate cuts. Powell's being really, restrictive right now. And for those that don't know, one of the big things that just happened in 2026 was there was a Department of Justice probe into Powell, basically a lawsuit where they're accusing him things. And he actually came out publicly and recorded a video, and he was saying where, the only reason why I'm getting this lawsuit and they're coming after me with, these criminal charges is because I'm basically not cutting rates. And this is a presidential overreach on the Federal Reserve, which is supposed to be an independent agency. So, long story short, right? The president, Powell, they're beefing. Powell's going to be leaving in May. The market's only pricing in, we're going to call it 0 to 2 rate cuts, 0.25% each in 2026. And everyone's going to be looking at inflation in regards to tariffs and the job market, okay? Because if inflation starts going up because of tariffs or other factors, well, you're not going to cut rates when inflation's increasing, right? The Federal Reserve actually does the opposite. They increase interest rates to combat inflation, but people are going to be watching, the inflation reading in regards to tariffs because people are, are worried with Trump's tariffs. It's going to raise the prices on everything. And then people are also going to watch the job market, right? Are people losing their jobs? Is hiring, coming back? Is it slowing down? So that's important to watch. And then the next thing I have for you here, right, for 2026 to be on the lookout for, it's just a broadening out from the market, right? 2025, we saw heavily, concentrated in, right, the Mag 7, our tech, right, the big AI names, NVIDIA, right, NVIDIA, Microsoft, Google, right, concentration into, a lot of these AI chip companies or the big tech companies that are doing a lot of capital expenditures in artificial intelligence. So now, right, the consensus with, all the banks and the narrative they're putting out right now is we're going to see a broadening out in the market from concentrated tech maybe into small caps and other sectors. So keep your eye out for that. And then, of course, right, 2026, artificial intelligence, right? The narrative's not going to suddenly stop. But the thing I want you guys to be on the lookout for is artificial intelligence capex. So basically what that means, what capital expenditures are, is the money that companies are spending on artificial intelligence. Now, potentially, we could see the AI bubble talk explode and maybe a lot of these, AI companies take a nosedive down only if, right, the revenue lags. And what I mean by that is all these companies have been spending money on artificial intelligence, but if the revenue doesn't come in, right, when they're spending and it's not showing a return on investment, these companies are going to get killed because they spent so much money on AI. And people are going to be watching exactly that this year and in different earnings reports, CEO statements, earnings calls, guidance, all of that. So just keep your eyes out for revenue linked to the AI capex from these companies. So that's a big movement in 2026 I want you guys to watch out for. And also the AI energy crunch, right? All these data centers, they need energy. And there's not enough of it when it comes to, as far as electricity. So everyone's going to be looking to other forms of energy for AI, if that's solar, if it's nuclear, right, renewable energy. So not only AI names, right, which was a huge AI chip names in 2025, but so far in 2026, I want you guys to be aware, is AI energy, okay? Most importantly, watch that. It's going to be a big narrative this year. Also, the defense industry. I mean, that's already so far been one of the biggest movers this year. But for those of you that don't know, right, the defense budget was set at $1 trillion for 2026. And just recently, Trump came out and said, no, I'm going to raise that to $1.5 trillion. So you just saw a huge, proposed increase in the defense budget, which, if that does come to fruition, is obviously going to allow government defense contractors to have more funding, more contracts to make more money, produce more weapons and all that. So they've been running like crazy. And, Trump has really been on an aggressive stance with different, talks of saying, "Oh, I want Greenland," and the thing with the Maduro was that just recently the Venezuelan president, right, capturing him. He's really been on the aggressive, so the defense industry has been booming, and it's going to be a big, big topic heading in 2026, especially with his, recent talks of increasing the defense budget from 1 trillion to 1.5 trillion. So that's a big, big thing I want you guys to watch in 2026. Also, critical minerals, right? As you know, keep your eyes out for all of that. That was a big talk heading into the tail end of 2025, right? China said, we're going to stop our exports of critical minerals. And then Trump said, oh, now this is a U.S. emergency. And, right, there was all those investments in different companies. So, right, that's going to keep going. And then also crypto, right? In 2025, we did see, kind of this sell off in the crypto. And what I think, could possibly happen here if we get the really big bull case, right? All of crypto could start to rebound to all-time highs, right? Bitcoin, Ethereum. 2025 was a big year for crypto, right? We saw a lot of bills getting passed regarding crypto. We saw a lot of talk with banks implementing ETFs and payment via crypto, right? Just a lot of bullish narrative in crypto towards the end of 2025. If it comes down with the president, right? Anything, I mean. So crypto is going to be a huge thing to watch for. And then, right now, silver and gold and metals. I could make a whole video talking about silver, right? Why it's doing this crazy move up. But for those of you that don't know, I mean, silver just went above $90 an ounce today, and the move has been parabolic, and it's a historic rally. And to sum it up short, I mean, right, there's a supply shortage. The mines can't keep up with demand, right? Institutional demand's going crazy. I was just telling you, right, 2026, watch out for AI energy investments. And for those of you that don't know, right, a lot of companies, don't have energy for data centers, so they've been looking into solar panels. Solar panels require silver to make them, right? So that's, a huge institutional demand for silver, which has been causing that move up. There's a lot of, things like the Fed are going to cut interest rates. Interest rates are going down. So, the demand for non-yielding assets increases. I could do a whole video on silver, but I'm just kind of trying to spitball things for you. But it's been going absolutely crazy. The physical price of silver is more than spot, right? Futures contracts, as far as it goes with silver, people are actually taking physical delivery of these future contracts. But, right, the actual physical silver that they store, they don't have enough, right? The futures contracts, right, they're supposed to be backed by physical silver, but historically speaking, only 1% to 2% of future contracts actually take delivery. People mainly use them for speculation, so they don't, have a 1-to-1 ratio of every futures contract to physical, the commodity. But in this case, a lot of people are starting to take delivery of silver because, well, the price keeps going up. So if they have a futures contract where they can get silver for $60 an ounce and it's at 90, well, of course you're going to say, well, you know what, I want delivery of that silver because I can have it for 60 an ounce. Boom, go and sell it for 90, right? Or it could keep going up. So that's creating this perpetual cycle, like of, well, people are taking delivery of the silver future contracts, but we don't actually have the physical silver, so we have to go on the market and buy physical silver. Huge crazy frenzy. It's crazy. I could do a whole video. This is just a nightly watch list, but right, silver and gold and metals, keep your eyes out for them. Copper, right, all of that still going crazy. And then I wanted to, talk about what's kind of been going on more recently, right? Intel's breaking out, right? Intel today is at $48. Now, for those of you that don't know, in 2025, Trump and the U.S. government took a stake in Intel, right? Gave them capital. They got equity in the company, and Intel's breaking out, right? You would, in 2025, you'd always see, Intel break above 38 and come back down, but just recently, I mean, it's actually been holding its gains, and I mean, this thing could go crazy. I'm telling you, just listen now. It's probably going to hit $50 and stall out, or if it cracks 50, it could go absolutely parabolic and continue its run. But watch Intel right now. It's actually breaking out and it hasn't sold off back down to 38, which has been kind of its magic number. So watch out for Intel now. Also, Netflix has still been selling off. Now, part of this is because, their acquisition for Warner Bros. And originally, right, they were going to do part of the acquisition was going to be debt, and the market hated it, and it sold off Netflix. It was like, oh my God, they're going to be taking on more debt, and you're going to be buying this company, and we don't think it's a good acquisition. And a lot of people, kind of had their doubts about it. So Netflix has been selling off, and it keeps selling. But just today, they kind of amended their offer for Warner Bros. And they proposed an all cash offer, which, could kind of, settle down the Netflix investors right now because they're not going to take on more debt. So we'll see how that plays out, right? When that deal will settle and how it actually ends, if it's all cash or if it involves, equity and debt. So pay attention right now for those individual names. They're kind of hot on the market, Intel and Netflix. Also, right, I was just telling you, right, about the defense industry in 2026. Well, right, President Trump, set the U.S. military to capture the Venezuelan president, Maduro, brought him back to the U.S. And, the big talk is the U.S. oil companies going into Venezuela to capture all of that heavy crude oil. Now, obviously, right, oil companies, Exxon, Chevron, all of that. And then the heavy crude processors, keep your eyes out for that. That's going to be a big, big thing coming in 2026 of Venezuela and the oil companies. They've all been breaking out. I mean, ExxonMobil today is hitting an all-time high. But, all right, I wanted to bring that up because it's recent and I haven't talked about it because it's the first watch list of 2026, baby. And then also today, Iran, right? Another big mover in the defense industry too. But we did get a candle down today, a big, big candle down on USO because Trump was doing, this meeting with reporters in the Oval Office. And he briefly said today that the killing has stopped in Iran. So basically that was good news out of there, but it sent a candle down on USO, basically because if, conflicts keep going on in Iran, well, that could, definitely create volatility in the oil markets, lower supply of oil, so the price of crude oil was going up. But we got a big candle down basically because Trump was kind of saying things are chilling out over there. And you saw a big candle down on ExxonMobil because of that. So keep your eyes peeled out on the Iran situation right now and oil companies, right? It's all kind of playing together. And then, right, I did also talk about this before because in the beginning of the video, I was talking about, watch out for rate cuts in 2026 and, kind of what that means to the market. But I already talked about it, but I'm bringing it up again, right? The DOJ probe into Powell, right? He claims it's presidential overreach for not cutting rates. You can look into the whole story around that. But, basically that was a big thing that already happened this year. A lot of people are saying, hey, the Federal Reserve is supposed to be independent. It's this big debate. Look into that. So that's what's been going on. And then today, right, I have note about today, right? The market was red today, essentially on bank earnings sell-off. So right, all the banks started to report their earnings reports, and they basically didn't meet analyst expectations, so they started to sell off. That's why the market was in part red today. Also, financials were selling off more because there was news that came out. Trump said he wanted to do an interest rate cap on credit cards. So, for example, instead of these credit card companies charging you 30% interest rates, well, instead they can only charge you maximum 10%. Now, there's a big debate on if that's actually going to go through and if he should allow it because, people are saying, well, if he only can charge 10% interest rate on credit cards, well, then credit card companies are going to be more selective in who they give credit to, so then consumers would be able to borrow less, buy less, right? Get into a whole big debate there. But part of the sell-off is, right, you're seeing financials like Capital One selling off big time, the banks because of earnings, the interest rate cap on credit cards. And then also, as I talked about, right, the big macro kind of talk from all these banks, right, is the broadening out into small caps and other sectors, right, out of the Mag 7, right? You had the huge move in 2025. So watch for the market to broaden out. Kind of saw that today with, the NASDAQ down, but small caps up. So that kind of tells you kind of where the money's going. So watch the indexes and what's up and what's down. That always tells you where the money's flowing. And on top of it, right, NVO, Novo Nordisk, and Eli Lilly, right? 2026 is going to be a big year for the GLP drugs, right? Weight loss pills. So for those of you that don't know, right, we built a pretty big position using our monthly deposits in Novo Nordisk in our long-term portfolio, right? It's probably one of the biggest positions we built in 2025. And one of the theses we had was that, right, the oral pill would come out in 2026 for Novo Nordisk. They'd be the first to get it. Sales would be good, more than expected, and the stock would rally. And that's exactly what we've seen so far, right? The stock has been going up a lot because Eli Lilly, their biggest competitor in the oral or the weight loss industry, right? They all first started with the injections. Well, Novo Nordisk is the only company right now approved, right, to sell the pills for weight loss. Now they are saying Eli Lilly will probably be approved probably in the second quarter of 2026 this year, but really all it's going to come down to, right, with the story there is sales, right? Who's making the money, who's dominating the market. But for right now, right, there's only one player in the game, Novo Nordisk. So the stock has been rallying, and the company has already came out and said that demand for the pill has been extremely strong. So, right, the stock has been rallying, the shorts are covering, and something to watch out for this year, right? The oral GLP, right? I'm going to call it the oral GLP pill battle. Novo Nordisk versus Eli Lilly. So, guys, I mean, that's everything I have for you. The new year just started. It's January 14th, right? Things are happening, right? We had already had big stuff happening, right? Trump going into Venezuela, capturing Maduro, DOJ probe into Powell shooting back at Trump over, the interest rate cuts, silver making an exponential move and, having this complicated story over the futures market and physical delivery and people in China going crazy over silver, bidding on the streets, buying silver on the streets. The market's going crazy and it's going to be a great year. I'm happy to come back, rested. We took a nice vacation at the end of the year. Everything slowed down. And now that stuff is starting to pick back up, it's time to get back on the grind, get dialed into the markets again. And it's going to be a good 2026. I'm happy for what's coming. And as always, guys, right, we're first to the news. So keep watching the watch list. I'm going to keep you guys, tuned in to what's happening to the markets. And as always, right, post in the comments, right? Post below. What are you guys, investing in for your long-term portfolio? Share news, right? Share all the headlines that you guys are seeing coming out and, your opinions on everything. It's important, right? The channel here, right? We're a community to share information, right? I only have my two eyes, right, to watch the market. But if everybody comes together and we all, share the headlines, share the news, talk about the plays so we can see where all the momentum is, like what we're investing, what we're trading, it helps. So, guys, that's everything I have for you. It's the first watch list of 2026. The watch list begins. I love you guys, and peace out.